apologize. But here we are, and it is a wonderful Saturday afternoon. You can feel spring is about to spring tomorrow. And I would like to turn this over to Mark Riegner, who will introduce you all to our speaker. Mark?
Thanks a lot, Andrew. And again, apologies to everyone for that little glitch we've been experiencing. Yeah, my name is Mark Riegner, and along with four colleagues, I serve on the coordinating committee for the North American Natural Science section. And we have been working to bring you a series of Zoom talks, as there was one last month, and there will be further Zoom talks coming up, as well as an in-person conference coming at the very end of April, beginning early of May. I am delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Although I haven't met Stephen Talbott in person, I feel that I've known him for some time. First, I've known him for his work in the book that has recently been published, but he was having essays, chapters already printed in the newsletter for the Nature Institute called In Context over the past number of years. So I'm sure many of you probably received that newsletter, and Stephen has had various installments of the work that he's synthesized and was published as a whole recently in 2025. So I know him through that work. And I've also met Stephen, in parentheses, for two other recorded talks that he gave. One was for the Linnaean Society's 2021 conference on evolution on purpose, and the other was for the Nature Institute's live audience lecture that was recorded as well. I was fortunate to see both of those. And finally, we met on Zoom last week with Andrew Linnell to figure out how to set up for today's talk, how to eradicate any glitches, which we did on our end, but it didn't seem to make its way through the pipeline. So a bit of background on Stephen. From 1998 until his recent retirement, Steve was a senior researcher at the Nature Institute, again in Ghent, New York. Previously, Steve was a senior editor at the technical book publisher O'Reilly and Associates, and before then working for many years in software engineering organizations. He is author of a number of books, The Future Does Not Compute being one of them, Devices of the Soul being another, and co-author with Craig Holdridge of the Nature Institute, Beyond Biotechnology. For today's talk, Steve will draw from his recently published book, Organisms and Their Evolution, Agency and Meaning in the Drama of Life. And there it is, beautiful watercolor painting on the cover. And that book is available through the Nature Institute website. So I encourage you to check out the book on the website. And you can also download for free, if you desire that, various chapters separately that are also on the Nature's Institute website. Today, Steve will argue that organisms, in particular plants and animals, live lives full of meaningfulness, as I like to put the emphasis, that cannot be satisfactorily described by reducing them to terms of chemistry or physics alone. There is something more which requires us to look deeper into the phenomena. When we do, we discover organized, integral, purposive, and end-directed performances. That is, meaningful performances. Accordingly, we need to reconsider that bodily structures arise from such performances, not the performances from pre-existing structures. We have to invert the way we tend to look at the world from a materialistic perspective to a more holistic perspective. Thus, when we consider nature, the nature of biological causation, one needs to recognize that context matters. Context is all. When we engage in such a manner, we become sensitized to the meanings of life, and it's the plural, meanings, the meanings of life, which is the title of his talk today. The meanings embodied by the organisms in our world. With that, I'd like to welcome Steve Talbott to this presentation today. And take it away, Steve. It's all yours. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Mark, for that excellent summary of the book. And good afternoon to everybody. I am indeed Steve Talbott, and right now I am indeed very pleased to be here, which is a special privilege, and I thank you all for it. First of all, I would like to be clear that I am not a biologist. I suppose you could say that I have all my life been an autodidact. You might also say that perhaps an outsider can see certain things that are difficult for an insider to acknowledge. All of which may be true, but can sound ever so slightly grandiose. Moreover, there's a simple and surprising truth of the matter which puts things in a rather different light. It was 2008 when Craig Holdridge, the director of the Nature Institute, suggested that I might be interested in looking into epigenetics. The idea appealed to me. It happens that before I began working at the Nature Institute, I had worked for a number of years in the software engineering organizations of computer manufacturers. The surprise was that when, as a non-biologist, I turned my attention to or away from technology and computers to genetics and molecular biology, I found myself on strangely familiar ground. And it required, of all people, Richard Dawkins, the eager herald of biology's besetting pathologies, to help me see why this was so. He had written, and I quote, "What is truly revolutionary about molecular biology is that it has become digital. Genes are long strings of pure digital information. The machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of a molecular biology journal might be interchanged with those of a computer engineering journal." Now, Dawkins' various assertions about genes may be crazily wrong in general, but he was unfortunately right that the way biologists think and theorize about genes has long been computer-like. So anyway, I had very little adjustment to make when I turned my attention to the literature of genetics and molecular biology. Now, I want to begin my talk simply by reading a couple of passages from the early pages of the book. The first passage contains the story of a female potter wasp, a story based on the research of the French naturalist Henri Fabre, as summarized by the British naturalist E.L. Grant Watson. So it's Watson I'll be quoting. And Andrew, if you could put up, actually, unlike what we talked about, slide 2 first for a minute or less, and then switch to slide 1 throughout my reading. And I'll explain why I'm engaging in this funny business. The second slide is of a pot on apparently a concrete base, and that is the pot that is built by the wasp I'll be describing. We're going to go right back to the wasp, which is on a pot that's not like this one, and it's a different species of potter wasp, of which there are many, many different species. But you and I would be very hard put to tell the difference between the wasp pictured here and the potter wasp being described. So anyway, here's the reading. The fertilized female builds a little domed house of sand spicules on some stone or rock foundation. The foundation ring is traced in minute pebbles. On this, she builds a series of concentric rings, each diminishing in circumference, so as to enclose a domed space. At the top, she leaves a hole. She then begins collecting certain species of small caterpillars. She stings these into a partial paralysis, but does not kill them, for they will be needed as fresh meat for the young she will never see. When the wasp has collected either 5 or 10 caterpillars, she prepares to close the dome, reducing the size of the hole. She now goes through a complicated process which would seem to indicate foresight on her part. Yet she has no foresight, only a highly developed instinct. From her ovipositor, she excretes a juicy substance, working it with her legs into a narrow inverted cone. With a thread of the same substance, she stitches the cone to the top of her domed building. Into the inverted cone, she lays an egg. She then seals up the hole, leaving the egg safe within the cone, suspended on a thread. This done, she goes off and builds another dome to repeat the same cycle of events. In a short time, the egg hatches into a tiny white grub, so helpless and delicate that if placed among the still living caterpillars on the floor of the dome, it would inevitably be injured. In its cradle, it is safe. When hungry, it spins a thread of its own on which it descends and takes a bite of caterpillar. If the wriggling caterpillars appear threatening, it can retreat up the thread and wait. In this way, the grub spends its infancy, but as it grows stronger, it risks a final descent and devours at its leisure the still living food that mother has so satisfactorily provided. And now a summary paragraph in conclusion. The mother wasp, who appears throughout her lifetime as a highly nervous and brilliantly alive creature, has built just the right sort of house for the offspring she will never see, and has provided just the right amount of food. She is singularly well adapted for her life. She stings the caterpillars just enough to keep them quiet, but not enough to kill them. She packs each dome with the right amount of food for male or female grub. The suspended cradle protects the tender infant from the rough reactions of the caterpillar while being eaten. Everything is in order, and as the emerging wasp dries her wings in the summer sunshine, she must surely feel that God is in her heaven and all is well with the world. The caterpillars might harbor different sentiments. Now, in this tail end of my life, when I find myself driven to ruminate on the less attractive features of my own life and of life in general, I am tempted to think that that last admittedly anthropomorphic comment by Watson about the sentiments of the caterpillars may be the most important thing in the entire story. But that opinion doesn't really belong in this talk. So maybe you're mistaken in thinking or hallucinating that you actually heard me say it. What I do want to say is that there is an obvious feature of the wasp story that we can hardly help taking for granted. Wasps, like all animals, somehow pursue purposive and well-directed lives despite not really knowing in any human sense what the heck they're up to. This, I guess, is evident to almost everyone. But what is not so evident is where all the guiding wisdom comes from. I suspect we still aren't really capable of articulating a fully adequate answer to this question. But that doesn't mean we should just ignore the obvious truth that the guiding wisdom is there. After all, we have to begin scientific research where we are. If we're not willing to start there, acknowledging both what we see, even if we don't particularly like it, and our own ignorance, then we can't expect to learn much. The second passage is my own writing, and it concerns the difference between a living dog and its corpse. Andrew, if you haven't already, you can remove the picture of the wasp, which incidentally was not visible on my screen while I was reading.
Already done. I removed the picture. I stopped the sharing already.
Okay.
To your biography.
So there's no screen sharing now. And this passage concerns the dramatic change in our descriptive language as we move between the living and the deceased animals. And it speaks more loudly than any philosophic convictions we may have about the animate and inanimate. Now, there's a lot of italicized key words in this passage. I hope that you will listen for them, since I cannot really italicize my voice without screwing up my reading. So, the passage. No biologist who had been studying the behavior of the living dog will concern herself with the corpse's behavior, nor will she refer to certain physical changes in the corpse as reflexes, just as she will never mention the corpse's responses to stimuli that no longer exist as such, or to the functions of its organs, or the processes of development being undergone by the decomposing tissues. Virtually the same collection of molecules exists in the canine cells during the moments immediately before and after death. But after the fateful transition, no one will any longer think of genes as being regulated, nor will anyone refer to proper or normal chromosome functioning. No molecules will be said to guide other molecules to specific targets, and no molecules will be carrying signals, which is just as well because there will be no structures recognizing signals. The words code, information, and communication in their biological sense will have disappeared from the scientist's vocabulary. The corpse will not produce errors in chromosome replication or in any other processes, and neither will it attempt error correction or the repair of damaged parts. More generally, the ideas of injury and healing will be absent. No structures will inherit features from parent structures in the way that daughter cells inherit traits or tendencies from their parent cells, and no one will cite the plasticity or the context dependence of the corpse's adaptation to its environment. And that's the end of that passage. If you really stop and think about the radically distinct languages applied to the living and the dead, they really tell you just about everything you need to know about organisms compared to the inanimate world. You might even wonder why I bothered to write the remaining 425 pages of the book. I can't emphasize strong enough that this language, we'll come to this a little bit later, already testifies to what biologists actually believe somewhere in their being about organisms. If we're not looking at purposive, meaningful, and well-organized end-directed behavior and the inherent wisdom of a ceaseless narrative that is always leading somewhere, then we're not looking with the eyes of a biologist, a scientist of the living, as opposed to a chemist or physicist. The phrase physically lawful describes only those aspects of the animal's body that continue uninterrupted according to exactly the same laws when it dies. If we restricted our understanding to this characterization, death would not even be a recognizable event. Everything purely chemical and physical just continues on uninterruptedly as it did before. And if you think this is a bit of an overstatement, please raise the point in the conversation. So, Andrew, now slide 3. I want to begin approaching the idea of contextuality, which Mark very rightly highlighted in his summary of my book. And I want to do that by looking at the hair follicle.
And we have it up now.
And now you're seeing it in a highly schematic representation. And I wonder, can there possibly be a more humble environment or niche than that of a hair follicle? But humble or not, we can learn something from it. For now, I'd just like you to take special note of the portion of the follicle occupied by stem cells. What's referred to as the bulge here happens to be the point at which a tiny muscle attaches to the follicle, which we'll see in the next slide. For now, I'm going to do little more than enumerate as quickly as I can some of the constituents of the hair follicle niche. In the same compartment with the compartment of the larger hair follicle niche, occupied by the hair follicle stem cells, it happens that there are also melanocyte stem cells, which are not shown here. And if your head is struck by ultraviolet radiation, some of those cells do a remarkable thing when you consider the nature of cells. They migrate to the surface of the skin and differentiate into cells that produce melanin, a dark pigment that protects you against ultraviolet radiation. And it happens that those melanocyte stem cells, the same stem cells, are immune cells. They're part of the immune system carrying out various immune system functions, not all of which are yet well characterized. Then there's the sebaceous gland. It secretes an oily or waxy substance that contributes not only to the oiliness of hair, but also to the barrier function of the skin and to the environment for the skin microbiome. So you see here, we're already just looking at these elements of the hair follicle niche. We're looking at elements that have multiple functions, immune functions along with protection against ultraviolet radiation, and sebaceous glands that help make the hair oily, but also contribute to the environment of the skin in a way that serves the microbiome of the skin and contributes to the barrier function of the skin. Multifunctionality is seemingly a fact of just about everything in an organism. You cannot separate clearly one niche or microenvironment from the larger organism. Now, Andrew, slide 4, please. This is a more detailed drawing courtesy of Wikipedia. You'll see rather inconspicuously in the middle of the figure a sweat gland, which I don't think I need to describe for you. And there's the muscle I referred to earlier, a hair erector muscle, which I imagine must be just about the smallest muscle in the body. Such a muscle is attached to every single one of your hairs, and under certain conditions, its contraction makes the individual hair, as we say, stand on end. And it causes a goosebump to form on the surface of the skin. Then you'll see in the lower part of the drawing, and they don't reach into the skin, dark blue and red arterioles and venules, which are connected to each other by networks of capillaries, and those capillaries provide a lot of nutrient that's necessary to the hair follicle. So let's see, I'm going down this list and I'm near the end. The papilla at the base of the follicle is a kind of germ for the whole thing. It has a hand in orchestrating almost everything going on in the hair follicle, including the activation, proliferation, and differentiation of hair follicle stem cells, for which it uses multiple molecular signals. And finally, there are thousands of protein transcription factors and epigenetic factors that shape the performance of genes participating in the production of the proteins relating to everything going on in the hair follicle. So I've mentioned certain things that imply structure in the hair follicle. And in fact, everything is in its proper place. But structure is easily overlooked because we so easily take it for granted. You know, why, for example, don't the hair shafts grow downward into the tissues below? If we saw a diagram picturing that, we'd recognize something was badly wrong. But everything is in its right place. And there is structure everywhere. We just take for granted that everything is properly structured and that every hair shaft knows, in quotes, to grow upward. Of course, knows is not quite the right word, but we never seem very successful at finding a better word. Nobody does. Every hair doubtless relies on certain environmental cues that we can identify, but how to recognize, interpret, and respond to a select set of cues is itself a sophisticated sort of knowledge. So we can't get away from the fact that the knowledge is there. This may be a good place to mention that a dozen or more, or maybe dozens, of molecular signaling pathways come to bear from near and far upon every one of your hair follicles. This is another way that the local microenvironment is tied into the whole. Now, molecular pathways, they're an interesting thing in themselves, and you can feel free to ask me about them later. But I can say right now that the word pathway may sound like a neatly linear causal sequence. And that is pretty much the intention. But a research group, I think in France, tabulated the interactions or crosstalk, as the molecular biologists say, between just 4 such pathways, molecular signaling pathways. And they found themselves looking at what they called a horror graph. And quickly it began to look as though, in their words, everything does everything to everything. And we will right away be taking note of the challenge to our usual causal thinking when it begins to look as though everything does everything to everything. Now, if we could return just for a moment to slide 3, Andrew, and that will be the end of the slides. I want to convey now the main surprise about this hair follicle niche. It's a surprise perhaps to us. It was a major shock to cell and molecular biologists because they never expected that anything like this could happen. This was some time ago, and it's now known to take place all over the body. So when the figure comes up, you can take note of the hair follicle niche, the hair follicle stem cell niche. And the question I want to put to you is this. Suppose the molecular biologist comes around with his handy dandy laser cell blaster and he points it at those stem cells and he kills a major part of them. It's the slide before that, Andrew. That's right. Thank you. He kills most of those stem cells. What do you expect would happen? Well, this was the shock for molecular biologists. What happens is that those epithelial cells from up above and the skin begin to migrate down into the stem cell niche. And there they de-differentiate. They lose their epithelial cell characteristics and they become stem cells. The fact that cells had such plastic identities and could shift their identity so readily according to need had been quite unknown. And this happens. It won't, however, happen to a particular epithelial cell if it finds itself in context with even one stem cell. That prevents the transition. But if a lot of the stem cells have been destroyed, then the epithelial cells can replace them and bring that compartment of the overall hair follicle niche up to snuff. And I wrote a paragraph commenting on that situation. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read that paragraph. Clearly, the different elements of the hair follicle environment are not rigidly fixed entities. Rather, their changing forms and relationships are somehow choreographed by the larger environment. So the goings on in the hair follicle illustrate very well how the context helps to decide what sorts of elements it will have, how they will be formed and transformed, how they will flow upward toward the places where they are needed, and how they will come into mutual relationship. In the last two sentences, I want you particularly to note, because it's critical. Nothing could be farther from the common picture of an organism being constructed bottom up from an available collection of well-defined building blocks capable of determining outcomes. It appears, rather, that the desirable outcome determines the building blocks. So keep that in mind as we go on. And now with that preparation And that can be the end of the slides, Andrew. So now with that preparation, I'd like to surprise you with something unexpected. You may not have heard about this, but actually biologists care a great deal about holism. In fact, you could almost say they've become fanatical about it. It's just that instead of using the word holism, which seems to have acquired a rather dodgy reputation, they are forever repeating the mantra, context matters. This concept, context matters, deserves a little consideration since it's not a naturally preferred choice of words, but has been forced on biologists by ongoing research. There are, of course, various ways one can speak about the importance of context. One can just say this interaction depends on the context. Or you can use such phrases as context specific or context dependent. And I kind of wanted to double check on myself. So I looked up in Google Scholar the phrase context dependent. And I did a search taking care to get only biologically relevant results and not, for example, results from literary criticism where you may also hear about context. And my search yielded over 500,000 hits, a good number of which were from article titles, and it's well worth taking a minute to go down and glance through those article titles. I think at the moment it's probably over 600,000 hits. It's growing all the time and very rapidly. But here's the remarkable thing. For all the appeals to context and for all the centrality of the concept of context in biology, no biologist I have ever run into in person or in print seems interested in explaining what is meant by the word context. And for good reason, as far as I can see. There's no workable meaning consistent with conventional biological understanding. If the idea of holism were really taken seriously, instead of being disguised behind a vague idea of context, it would turn upside down an awful lot of the conventional biological understanding. So we could summarize this entire business surrounding holism and context by saying that biologists know a lot more than they let on, maybe even a lot more than they are willing to admit to themselves. This brings us to one of the themes running through my book, which is that a habit of blind sight infects much of biology. So, what is blind sight? Well, imagine you're visiting a museum with a friend, and you're standing in a room where there's a large and prominent sculpture, say a sculpture of a human being, in the middle of the room. And you comment on that sculpture to your friend. And the friend says, sculpture? What sculpture? I don't see anything. And he's telling the truth. He doesn't see the sculpture. It's a well-known neurological phenomenon. It's called blind sight. And the interesting and relevant fact for us is that if you follow your friend around the room, you'll notice that he's walking very carefully around the sculpture instead of bumping into it. So he partly does see it, but not consciously. Now, I think this is analogic to the situation of very many biologists. They know very well that they are not supposed to see holism, and so many honestly can't believe they see it. And yet they manage to tiptoe safely around it by means of phrases such as context dependent, betraying the fact that they really do glimpse the holistic aspect of the organism. But it is nevertheless remarkable that so many rigorously trained investigators can routinely claim that things are causally dependent within their science without giving any thought to what they mean by their own words. But fortunately, we can give it some thought. To say that a particular interaction is context dependent seems clearly to suggest that the context plays a causal role of some sort in bringing the interaction about. And causation is not exactly something biologists are uninterested in. But you must admit they have a problem here. Where do they place a causal arrow that points from the context to a particular part? If it's truly context dependence they are talking about, then the arrow has to originate everywhere within the relevant context or whole. An arrow that originates everywhere is a rather difficult arrow to draw. And it's not the causal arrow molecular biologists like to draw from one discrete molecule to another. So in biology, we're not really talking about the usual scientific notion of a cause at all. And yet something causal is obviously going on. Maybe, and this is a whole different talk, we ought to be looking into the old idea of formal causation. In any case, I don't really know myself how to articulate the key idea here beyond saying that whenever we are talking about organisms, we find ourselves talking about all the complexities of what we might call, rather awkwardly, interiority. To watch the expression of interiority is less like tracing the interaction of point causes and more like watching the playing forward of a broad, meaningful context. For example, the forward movement or indirectness of a historical narrative or novel. How do we explain the causes underlying the way a story moves forward from one chapter to the next? If a single character performs a critical action in a famous novel or in a historical narrative, there might be entire books written to provide an explanation for why that action took place in its context. Why did President Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation when he did? And how did that affect the subsequent course of the Civil War? The explanations for such things tend never to be the same. And no wonder, since interior causes are almost infinitely multifaceted. But I'm going to leave that where it is. And I want to say something about what makes for a context. Whatever else is required, a context always involves the character, not of a single, discrete, and separable causal thought, but rather the wholeness of a context of thought. And this context is part of what I refer to when I speak of interiority. There are other aspects of interiority that can be extremely important, such as imagination, will, and aesthetic sensibility. But I am sticking with what is easiest to talk about. Ask yourself, what makes for the context of a baseball game as opposed to a football game? This is almost a trivially simple example, but it's worth thinking about. And the answer has a great deal to do with the very different rules of the game, which means the ideas expressing the defining character of the game. Further, the context includes, in addition to the rules proper, such things as the competitive format with its decisive concept of winning, together with the idea of how a team places in a league, how the playoffs are organized, and so on. There are also the values of sportsmanship, fair play, and maximal personal effort, along with other interior elements, such as the felt concern for providing players with reasonable protection from injury. Or even more simply, think of a checkerboard versus a chessboard. It's exactly the same physical board, but very different contexts, depending on whether the governing ideas are those of checkers or chess. Such examples illustrate the crucial role of thought in constituting a context. Without the thoughts, there is no context. But I should add that rigidly defined rules, as in a competitive game, are a far cry from the reality of organic context, such as the hair follicle niche, where epithelial cells can become hair follicle stem cells. What if a football player could, at need, change his identity and become a referee or member of the opposing team? So, after all this, can we say what a niche or a context or an organic whole actually is? And like everything to do with organisms, it's not an easy matter to nail down. But I don't think we can do better than the 20th century botanist Agnes Arber, who wrote, I'm quoting her now, the biological explanation of a phenomenon is the discovery of its intrinsic place in a nexus of relations, extending indefinitely in all directions. To explain it is to see it simultaneously in its full individuality as a whole in itself and in its subordinate position as one element in a larger whole. In other words, context, whole, and part can never be rigid, absolute terms in biology. They are bound up with interweaving spheres of activity. We need to gain some practice in thinking, not with single distinct point causes, but rather with reasonably coherent, meaning-soaked locales wherever we find them. And the world of meaning is a kind of spiritual unity, so that there are always threads of significance linking different contexts, however disparate. And I want to conclude with a very brief commentary on a closely related topic. The suggestion behind nearly everything I've talked about is that all biological description implies a kind of purposiveness, directedness, organization, and context. For example, would the word organization, heavily leaned on by biologists, retain any meaning at all if you subtracted out all organizing ideas? Just think about it for a moment. What would be left of the meaning of organize if there were no ideas in view according to which the organizing takes place? I have been trying all along here to draw attention to how bodies of thought underlie all the key terms of biology today. So as we've seen, a certain kind of wise and holistic organizing thought seems to lie at the heart of everything biological. And however, what does the biology do with this thoughtful interiority? Here, again, we can say that biologists have become almost fanatical about interiority, except that they can't use that word or anything much like it. So instead, they speak of information, code, communication, and program. These are all, in a way, synonyms for the interiority of language, thought, and meaning, but they are also extremely effective in concealing the very idea of interiority. Biologists always seem to have in mind things rather than thought, even though thought is brought in surreptitiously and often is what gives plausibility to biological explanations. When, for example, they speak of the genetic text or coded information or the language of the genome, are they analogizing bits of DNA merely to the physical letters of a text? Or are they speaking honestly of a language giving expression to an immaterial realm of meaning? Their language often allows them to imply both the exterior and interior reference, while they only own up to, or perhaps only see, the exterior reference. This allows them to hold to a materialistic stance while seeming, by virtue of the language of meaning, to offer real explanations for organic activity. So again, we seem to have an example of the biologist's blind sight, a truth that's somehow recognized and then gingerly tiptoed around with a great preference for talking about exterior things rather than interior realities. This shunning of interior realities seems to me the severely disabling blindness that the biological sciences, if not all sciences, suffer from today. but biologists need to be called on their ambiguous and sometimes even duplicitous language. And that, I think, is our job. Thank you. And Andrew, I gather you'll be
I will. I'll be your moderator, and I see Bruce already knew what to do. On the very bottom of your Zoom window is a heart-shaped thing with React. And if you click that, you'll see that one of the options is raise hand. So if you can click raise hand, if you want to ask a question, then I can call on you and we'd like you to speak your question so that the recording has it, because a lot of people who wanted to be here today, we have about half of those who registered. So, and that's because of screw ups we did. So I want to get the questions in a format that those who are watching the recording can see it. And Bruce, we can start with you, and thank you. And
Das ist das Webinar, was ich am 19. April machen
Otto,
soll.
Otto,
Das
can
hat er
you
mir
go
jetzt
on?
schon mal geschickt.
Okay, go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, that wasn't me. I wish my
Right.
German was that good. Well, I am a biologist, retired now, and I organized the only symposium that I know of with a colleague from Switzerland on Agnes arbor in 1999, presented at the International Botanical Congress in 1999, and published in Annals of Botany, one of the probably the, if not the major botanical journal, one of the top 3 botanical journals. And you can find those papers if you ever want to look at them. They're out there. I've also been a student of Rudolf Steiner for a very long time, and I'm very familiar with Steve's work and Stephen's, I'm not Steve's, Craig's work and some of Stephen's work. I hardly know where to start. It seems like Stephen wants biologists to adopt the same terminology that he uses out of an anthroposophic or that kind of context. And that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because they have a different history. They have a different conceptual history, a different social history, and and biologists are not philosophically inclined. I have watched some of my colleagues of biologists listen to philosophers talk, maybe about different subjects, with expressions of complete disgust on their face. The only thing that a biologist likes less than a philosopher is someone who works in the humanities. Now, I'm making gross generalizations, but they're not completely untrue. And this shapes how biologists talk about the same things that Stephen is talking about. So Stephen says that there isn't a definition of context. Well, there isn't a definition of context because people recognize that it is so complex. So you could say there's a recognition that there's a context in genetics. There's a context from the environment. There's a cellular context. There's all these different contexts that people take into account. And which context you're looking at depends on the questions that you're asking and the techniques that you're using. And yes, they do that. And causality, I mean, so in one way thing that I'm saying is I feel like Stephen's comments are directed to what was happening in biology when Craig wrote his first book in 1996. At that time, this lecture would have been right on. Biology has changed tremendously since 1996. My little symposium on Agnes arbor was a mini kind of thing about some of those changes that were taking place. Okay, so that's half of it. I know this isn't a question. The thing that many of the things that Stephen talks about are what creationists use to argue for special creation. What special creationists don't pay attention to, and what anthroposophists oftentimes don't pay attention to, is variation. And this is the hardest lesson I had to learn. It took me most of my career to learn what I'm about to tell you. If there's any one biological law, it is that variation exists in every aspect of biology. So if we look at the mud wasps, Steve gave you the archetypal condition where a mud wasp is successful in building the nest. There are mud wasps that are not successful in building the nest. They stop halfway through. There are mud wasps that seal the nest before they lay the egg. There's all of these different variations, even within a species. That kind of variation is the stuff that Darwin used in order to form his theory of evolution. So I feel like both in creationist circles and in anthroposophic circles, we don't really understand the importance of studying not just the archetypal examples when everything is going well, but the variation that occurs in organisms. Or as Stephen Gould would say, the things that go wrong. Evolution is shown in the things that go wrong, not in the things that go right. Not just go wrong, but the things that are designed imperfectly. And Gould gives a lot of examples of those. Now, I'm not arguing for a strict Darwinist understanding of evolution or biology. And I'm not going to go on about that, but this is another kind of subject. And I think Stephen is quite right in pointing out the problem of interiority that is not recognized in biology now. And I say it's important because interiority, because all of those theories exist inside of me, and that self-awareness is not recognized as part of something that influences biological theories. Well, anyway, I just wanted to say a few things on this. I know it's not complete coherent. We would have to sit down and really have a long discussion about this. I think these issues are very important, but I think that there are things that Stephen has not completely represented accurately for what's happening in contemporary biology. And Stephen, I'm happy to hear your comments.
Do you have some comments, Stephen? And
I find it a little difficult to hold in my very old mind everything that has just been said. I found parts of it hopeful that, there are things changing. There's a lot of talk about agency in biology now, consciousness, things that were not there a couple of decades ago or a few decades ago. But maybe I can come to the nub of the matter best by taking up the reference to intelligent design, which I'm particularly sensitive to. I've written articles that have convinced intelligent design people that I'm a militant atheist and I don't like them at all. And my criticism of intelligent design is that they're too much like conventional biologists. They do not see the organism as possessed of the intelligence, for example, of a potter wash. They see it as something kind of inflicted from outside, from a creator who is somehow all transcendence and no eminence. And I think this is a terrible mistake. They end up arguing with conventional biologists about the likelihood of the kind of mistakes that were mentioned here that would allow for the kind of evolutionary origin of new proteins to explain evolutionary changes. And I think that's just continuing what is totally off base. What is on base, and I don't care whether it's my vocabulary or totally different vocabulary. What I care about is whether the wisdom we see in organisms is acknowledged. And as I said in my talk, I don't even claim to have a good understanding of how we're to take that. And I don't think we need that understanding in order to acknowledge that it's there. And what I think is crucial for biology is that they acknowledge it's there. And if we have organisms in which everything we see is indirected, future directed, that seems to me, well, I could add, intelligently directed, mistakes and all. And I think the mistakes are very important to see. I was vaguely alluding to that when I referred to the comment about the sentiments of the caterpillars being eaten by the potter wash. Something is wrong all over the place. So now in my fashion and old age, I've lost my train of thought. But I think I was saying that when we take organisms as the intelligently future directed beings, they show themselves to be in everything they do, including the creation of all their different cell types, including their creation of germ cells for the next generation. They're future oriented in their creation of all the different cell types in their body. And we have no reason to think they're less future oriented in their creation of germ cells for the next generation. So it seems to me that all this is the kind of thing that should make evolutionists perk up a little bit and listen and ask, what could this have to do with evolution? And if they would get over their fixation on genes and random accidental changes to genes, and instead look at the coherence of what goes on in the creation of a new cell, including a germ cell, then they would see possibilities that are just not within their world of thought now. And I would agree with you, Bruce, that I'm talking about a very different world of thought than is present today in biology. But I do feel the future of biology depends on the recognition of all the various sorts of meaning that we see in organisms today. And I could look forward to that conversation you mentioned. Everything you said suggests to me it would be a very worthwhile for both of us, I hope. Certainly for me, it would be a very worthwhile conversation. Anyway, that's it for the moment.
Okay, we will try to finish. It's coming up 3 o'clock Eastern time, and we'll try to finish in about 20 minutes with all the remaining questions. So Ken Simpson, you're up next if you want to come off of mute. And then William, is that William Gold?
Walter Goldstein.
You'll be next. So Ken?
Yes. Of late, I've been reading a book called Is There a Garden in the Mind? A memoir of Alan Chadwick and the organic movement in California, written by Dr. Paul A. Lee, who is was a professor of philosophy there. And chapter 4 deals with Goethe, the vitalist contra Newton, and physicalist. At the end of this chapter, he says, is there a figure we can point to whom the physicalist vitalist conflict goes in a way that dramatically illuminates the issue? Yes, his name is Sigmund Freud. In his autobiography, Freud mentions how he went to a public lecture when he was a young man and heard Goethe's Ode to Nature read out loud. He was so moved, so he says, he decided right then and there to enter the medical sciences in order to unveil nature's mysteries, another kind of Freudian slip. Can't you see him rather hesitantly and somewhat indelicately pulling it up on the old girl, the goddess of nature? And where does he end up? Our young Freud in Brooks' laboratory, taking the physicalist oath and dissecting the nervous system of a certain order of fish in search of neurons. Freud is important to me not only because I did my doctoral thesis on his concepts of guilt, but because he is a seminal figure in the physicalist-vitalist conflict. From the vitalist ode to the physicalist ode, he was inspired by one and took the other. The physicalist-vitalist conflict, call it a split, goes through him. He suffered a nervous breakdown over it when he was told to leave the lab, partly because he had cocaine on his nose and go back and get his medical degree. Cocaine wasn't the only reason he was Jewish. Poor Freud was to know that Goethe's Ode wasn't by Goethe, when even Goethe didn't know it. Goethe accepted it into his canon late in life, forgetting that he had written it, even though it was good enough for him to claim authorship of it. It was
how
an
much longer
old,
is this
hold on,
reading?
I'm almost done here.
Okay.
It was an old Orphic hymn, and who should have found that out working at the Goethe archive in Weimar, but Rudolf Steiner, who did the textual critical work. Freud was moved anyhow. I've got 2 more paragraphs and then I'll quit, because there are parallels between what we're talking about here in terms of spiritual scientific research in the area of natural sciences. Over 80 predicates of the goddess are compressed into this 30 hexameters. She is the age-old mother of all, father, mother, nurse, sustainer, all wise, all bestowing, all ruling, regulator of the gods, creator firstborn, eternal life of the mortal province. This universal goddess is not the personification of an intellectual concept. She is one of the last religious experiences of the late pagan world. She possesses inexhaustible vitality, not sure is cosmic power. The hymn is dedicated to Physis, that's Physis. In this nostalgic remnant of old European culture, where such powers were somewhat intact and able to inspire, I remember seeing a torso of the goddess Fortuna at a Roman antiquities museum in Germany, and when the guard was not looking, he kissed it and asked for a blessing. Almost done. Goethe's fragment on nature, which first appeared anonymously in 1782 or 1783, was circulated in manuscript. Goethe wrote to Nebel that he was not the author, no matter it came to be known as Goethe's Ode. Years later, he saw the ode again and wrote to Chancellor von Mueller, although I cannot remember composing these observations, they are quite in accord with the conceptions in what my mind then soared. The year was 1828, the year of the artificial synthesis of urea. The main point to make here is to juxtapose the vitalist ode to the physicalist oath. Now, people who are practicing science often don't have the freedom to be of an organic, contextual nature always. They're driven by the philosophy of whatever department one is in, even now. Anyway, perhaps others have something to say. I hope you enjoyed that reading. Earlier on, Lee talks about how botany is a subset of physics in terms of its nomenclature to gain acceptance.
I don't know, Stephen, if you want to comment, or should we go on to the next question? Are you set with that?
I don't really have a comment. I've never studied Freud, and somehow, very tangentially, that reminds me of the saying that I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy. But I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez. Okay. Walter, you're up next.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, first off, Steve, thank you very much. That was great. I really enjoyed it. And, it's also a bit irritating. Why is it that people have this blindness? And, it's a kind of a prejudice, and it does have a social context, actually. It's built into the university system to a certain extent, that you have to act a certain way and think a certain way. But we need to go beyond that. Now, I do have a question for you, though. I'd really like you to see if you could define interiorality for me.
That's a very, very difficult question. In a way, it's almost a kind of self-contradictory question. I'm focused on the idea of meaning in a way, but what if we had to define meaning? You have to already have meaning, a grasp of meaning, in order to grasp the definition. It's something you can't define. And you can't define very usefully because a person has to already be apprised of meaning in order to get what you're saying about meaning. And about interiority in general, I would say it's such a fundamental part of our life. When we enter this earth, we're just in a sea of meaning. And we learn progressively, bit by bit, to appreciate various bits of that meaning. And that's about all I could say. It's so fundamental that to talk about defining it is not very helpful. We either experience it or we pretend that we don't. But in fact, it's the very meat of our lives. Everything we do, the way we walk, every conversation we have, we mean something with every gesture, every word. Why do we talk to each other if we don't have some awareness of what language is all about, what it means? If we didn't have any grasp of meaning, we might as well sit there as a stone or rock on the hillside and just take it all in whatever way we can. uh, I don't think there's any more to say. I'm sorry to brush that question off. I don't mean it as a brush off. I think it's a very excellent point to take in that defining meaning is a no-go. It's simply not something we can reasonably hope to do. But we can reasonably hope to sense how fundamental the idea of meaning is to our lives, everything in our lives. So I thank you for the question, and I apologize for not being able to answer it more straightforwardly.
Walter, you were asking about interiority, I guess.
Inferiority, yes. But
as opposed to inferiority.
Not inferiority, not at all. But what's so interesting, Stephen, about your answer to me is that you're uniting the interiority of your experience with the interiority of the world around you. And it's precisely that which is taboo in the university system, that you're actually saying there's a relationship between my interiority and the world around me. If I didn't experience interiority in myself, I couldn't actually sense it in the world or see that it must exist in the world around me, right? I mean, there's a linking that you're doing.
That's a superb point. I have an article coming out in the spring 2026 issue of the New Atlantis called Still Haunted by Laplace's Demon. And am I still connected?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Everything's fine.
Something funny on my screen. But anyway, the first line of that is, we're all materialists now. And I had intended to include in my talk a concluding section that actually began with that line. And it went on, if I can read my notes here, that we all actually experience things around us as if they were collections of non-qualitative, inexpressive, and indifferent elementary units or particles. One electron is identical to every other electron. So nothing to see here might be the motto of the particle physicist. And the result is we're dealing with a world in which there is no spirit, nothing qualitative or expressive, nothing we can reasonably call creative, nothing for which we can feel any empathy or sense of kinship. That's where we are today. And I think that was something akin to what Steiner was getting at when he said that atomism was a kind of prison in which we moderns were captured. And my key interest is how we get out of that prison. And I was actually, when in an earlier version of this talk, I was hoping this conversation could be centered on that question, which I need an answer to, as well as maybe some of you feel a need to answer for an answer. How do we get out of that prison? And what I've been talking about regarding organisms is about that prison, basically, in biology.
Mhm.
But we need a way out. And I'm not sure I have the way out. I was raised by receiving in the fourth grade a book called Our Friend the Atom. It was deeply influential in me, and I grew up under a totally conventional scientific education. And I've spent the rest of my life trying to find a way out of it. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And you're asking a profound question.
Let's go on to Barry's next. Barry, come off of mute.
There. So I'll try. Be quick. I really appreciate, Bruce, what you brought up, and Walter as well. And I wanted, first of all, just to defend Steve a little bit. I didn't hear that Steve was trying to use anthroposophical language, Bruce. I know that many of us here want to do that. In fact, you'll know, Bruce, that in May we're having a conference. And it's a conference to try to correlate spiritual science and natural science, look at correlations. And I'm sure that conference will drive you nuts if you come. I hope you do. But I do appreciate what you say about, and in terms of language, I think Craig may speak more in terms of Goethe's language, which anthroposophists share, as you know. Steve, I think, is being very careful and is not speaking that language. But just that's in his defense. Then the second thing I want to say is I very much appreciate what you say about science and the frontier now. You know, I can hold up the book by, oh, it can't if I blur my screen. You know, as an example of a recent book by Capra and Luisi. And, you know, I've read this and appreciate very much in it, but it just doesn't quite get as far as Steve is going. You know, systems theory and holistic, this point of interiority that Walter's making, etc., is not quite there. And this is a big question. And I do appreciate you bringing up variation and evolution. I was just at a Thomist conference, Thomas Aquinas folks, back in DC, that Mark was going to speak at, but had to miss it. And I brought up the issue of evolution and how new forms arise. We know that they do. For the Thomists, that's a difficult problem. So just trying to appreciate the things that have been said.
Well, thank you very much, Barry, for that. Jeff, over to you. Come off of mute. There you are. Good.
Hey. Hello, Steve. It's Jeff Falzone here. I love the presentation, and I have a couple comments and then a question for you. As I've been reading your book, one of the things that's just delicious for me is all the descriptions of what you call the performance of the cell or the performance of the organism and how intricately coordinated they are, and that's the context dependence as you refer to it. And there's so many rich descriptions you give that today, when you were talking more about some of that, it brought back to mind when I was taking my Goethean studies course with Dennis Klochek, and he said a quote from Steiner. I've never found it, but I loved it, which was that if you pay close enough attention to the way you put on a coat, you will instantly be initiated. And in the class, we all spent an hour putting on each other's coats and trying to pay attention to what that was like. And when I look at what's going on in a cell from your book and the descriptions of the coordination, it reminds me of what it looks like to watch somebody put on a coat, all the strange little moves that have to happen in coordination. And from the outside, it seems impossible to create laws of how you flinch your shoulder a little and then stick out your arm. It just seems like you could never create laws for that. But we all know from the inside, from the subjective side, it's an intuitive flow of actions that come from a holistic moment to moment experience. And all of this to say, as I get so excited by over the last 20 years, how physicists more and more are finding it easier and easier to take on a consciousness first perspective of reality. And they all argue, and there's all the different panpsychisms and all that, but it's becoming increasingly easy for secular people who aren't coming from a religious point of view to just intuit that maybe it's the flip. Maybe it's not the objects we need to see first, it's the subject. And I have this feeling that over the years, that's going to seep into biology a little bit more, as that intuition is taken up by more and more people looking at the intricate coordinations you're describing. My question for you is, in your own life, did you always just intuit the fundamental nature of meaning and kind of instinctually resist all the attempts to teach you that you have to start with the object to get to meaning, like meaning's the result or the epiphenomenon of objective motions? Or did you kind of slam into a wall and have to reconfigure your thinking about science and experience?
Well, it's very difficult to say, for anyone to say what their own inner journey has been. I think we all try to say it at times, and it's mostly a bunch of bunk. We don't know our inner journey. At least I don't. I do want to say in response to the previous speaker, I think it was Barry, I'm not a member of the Anthroposophic Society. If I sounded like I was trying to speak anthroposophically, it would be very weird, because I'm not in that world, and I especially have tended to stay away from the more occult aspects of Steiner's work. I've never been able to work with anything that I couldn't try to figure out what I could understand. So anyway, I did run into a wall to answer this last question. I actually put out an article a good number of years ago in the Nature Institute's newsletter in context. It was called The Trouble with Qualities. And that was a real stumbling block for me. I feel like now, if I hadn't been able to come up with an interesting, a worthy answer to that question of qualities, I was at the end of the line. I had nothing else to contribute. It happens, as those things tend to happen, that at the same time I was beginning to work with a Russian drama teacher who led workshops on the language of, how did he put it? Anyway, the language of nature. And he taught me to gesture everything, gesture a telephone wire, gesture clouds, gesture rain. He'd ask, what's the difference between a pond and the ocean, which would put out a higher pitched sound, which would put out a deeper sound. And his point was that everything out there has an interior. And we can get to know that interior in here, and we can produce gestures that are the proper gestures of what's out there. So I think I was probably the slowest student he ever had. And I struggled and struggled and struggled with it. He said, gesture a raindrop, falling rain. And I think all he wanted was the vertical gesture. But I was thinking, oh, there must be something, what's the word, super sensible here I was supposed to be catching on to. And eventually I learned he just wanted me to learn to see what's out there qualitatively. And I eventually realized, yeah, everything is qualitative. There's nothing that isn't. And that's the very substance of things. Take away the qualities and ask yourself, what is left of the world? It wouldn't be there for you, certainly. And I believe it wouldn't be there at all if it wasn't made of the nature and potential of qualities, which are taken in all different kinds of ways by different organisms, because it's an infinitely variable potential. And it's a potential that's sufficient for every creature alive to take its own experience from the world. So that's what I came to, and I decided through this work with my Russian mentor, and that's changed everything for me. I slowly but surely began to look up at the sky, look at the hills opposite my home, and see a qualitative world. And that's wonderful, but I realized that mostly I'm still the child of my upbringing. And the wind is what? It's a collection of particles. And I haven't been able to fully digest the fact that the notion of particles is a total lie. It's a total lie in the physicist's terms. It's a series of forces and potentials. And until we have something sensible, we don't have any reality as such. We're waiting for the potential to manifest to us. And it does in the way things manifest themselves to us, and in no other way. And as I said a moment ago, without the qualities, there's no such manifestation. The qualities are everything. And where did the particles come from anyway? They came from a desire by scientists to mathematize everything and to remove from it all the so-called subjective aspects. That is, anything we might actually experience. So we're not looking at the experienced world when we're dealing with these qualities that we so easily assume are what are hard particles that the wind and everything else is made of. And that's just crazy. And we have to escape that craziness. And I certainly have not been able to fully do it. I find myself all the time caught up in the imaginations of my childhood. And that goes back to Freud, I guess. But anyway, that's enough.
Stephen, thank you so much. Jonathan, I see you have a question, but we're out of time. If you send me the question, I will forward it on to Stephen, and hopefully, Stephen, you don't mind answering a question afterwards.
I'll be very happy to answer it. And my email address is stevekt@natureinstitute.org. And I'll do what I can to answer. I may be mostly disappeared in the near future, but I guess that's called retirement. I figure at age 80, I'm finally entitled to some retirement.
Yeah.
Can we at least hear the question, please?
I'm really grateful for all of this, and I will welcome further questions. But give me time. That's all I ask.
Okay. So, Mark, I'm going to turn this over to you then to close this out. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, well, I want to first of all thank everyone for participating. And certainly, Stephen, I thought that was a wonderful talk. You raised a lot of questions in me. This notion of interiority, it's something it is so difficult to define what it is, but yet we know. We know when we have a feeling, we know when we have a thought. It points to an interiorization that we all possess. And I think it also really applies to Goetheanistic science. I think Goethe, as a poet, as an artist, and a scientist, was delving into his own interiority and bringing phenomena to life in the objective imagination. And I think, of course, Rudolf Steiner recognized this when he was a young man, being exposed to Goethe's works, when he had the task to edit as editor for Goethe's work. And one of Steiner's quotes that I really have been impressed by my whole adult life is, becoming aware of the idea in reality is the true communion of the human being. Becoming aware of the idea in reality is the true communion of the human being. And so nature becomes interiorized, I feel, through this approach. And I think that's what Stephen was also trying to get at with interiorization. And it's something that lives within us, and we could cultivate that and use it as an organ, as a sense organ, to giving us a window into the world. So I want to thank you again, Stephen, for, I thought, a very inspiring talk. Also to Andrew for helping to set up with the technological side of things, and all the folks who have tuned in. Sorry again for that little glitch we had at the beginning, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all for participating, and sorry for our glitch.
Thank you, Stephen and Andrew. Yes.
And we'll see you all hopefully in the end of March. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.